All right, today we're going to take a look at America's role, the Americans' role, like the citizens of the United States, some of them not citizens of the United States, and their role in our victory over the Axis powers. All right, so here's 9 questions we'll be able to answer by the end of this. What are Higgins boats? Who was the associate president? Okay, and what was his role in helping us win the war? What was the name of the plant in Michigan that made 340 planes a month? That's like more than 10 planes a day. What's a Liberty ship and how did it help us win the war? 2 examples of brand loyalty. In industry, we became this, quote unquote, to win the war. 2 ways that we paid for the war. Number 8, how did women contribute to the war effort? And number 9, how did African Americans' contributions to the war effort help lead to the civil rights movement? Okay, so you probably have seen this picture somewhere before. Part of your assignment today is going to be an ed puzzle on how to do this, or on what this means and where it came from. This is the real picture. Okay, so this is Rosie the Riveter. Okay, this is the real Rosie. Okay, and the video that you see, the ed puzzle you see, will get into all kinds of details about this and what they're doing. I will just point out to you the size of Rosie's arms. Okay, here, I mean, she's a friggin' beast in this picture, showing the strength. Okay, was the idea, the strength of women. And then she's got the riveter in her hands. She's got her work outfit on. She's got goggles on. She's got a face shield on. Okay, and if you look down at her foot, you will see that her foot is on top of a very important book that we talked about in this unit already. All right, so women in the war effort, right? So Rosie was a fictional character, right? It's not one person. And in this fictional story, she worked in a factory while her boyfriend Charlie was at the war. The idea was that this is kind of like propaganda, okay, to get women to help out, because all the men, this is going to be a theme throughout this, not all the men, but a lot of the men were off fighting in the war. Anybody that was age eligible was off fighting in the war, which means we didn't have enough men to fight or to work in the factory. So we went in other areas that we would not have normally looked in, according to where our society was in 1941. So women of all ages and ethnic backgrounds really worked in the factories to help with the war effort. Okay, so women from all over the place. Okay, white women, African American women, Hispanic women, everybody was going to try to help out. Right. And again, the idea was, my boyfriend's in the war, my husband's in the war. If I could make some weapons that might help us win and get him home sooner, great. Okay. So the benefits of doing this for women, but for the employers, right, they thought that the women would be better at the mindless jobs at the beginning. That did not prove to be the case the entire time. But for women, this helped improve their self-worth. It proved that they could do the jobs that supposedly only men could do, right? That was the belief at the time. For African American women, 6.8% in 1940, 6.8% of industry jobs in America were filled by African American women. By the end of the war, it was 18%, okay, in industry jobs. That's a huge change, right? And again, proving that they could handle these jobs. Okay, so this is the Rosie the Riveter video that you'll see on your ed puzzle. That's also part of this today. After the war is over with, that Roman numeral 4 shouldn't be there. I apologize. The women work for the duration of the war. Okay, life returns to what was normal before the war, right? Some women were happy to go back to living their normal lifestyles. Other women, as you'll see in the video, they did not want to go back to being a housewife. If you want to be a housewife, that's great. But some of the women didn't want to do that, and they wanted to continue to work, and some of them did. Think of the picture of the 4 pilots when we talked about the diversity, right? The women that were pilots for the waves in World War II, the pride that was on their face when they were walking. A lot of the women felt the same way about working in a factory. So here's a Rosie Riveter picture, a female riveter in March of 1943. You can see the rivet gun there. That's important because that's in the Rosie the Riveter video. And she's on top of what looks like an airplane, okay, putting the rivets in. And you can see how many there are just in that one small picture. These were really important jobs. They had to be done, okay, and they didn't think the women could do these, but they proved that they could, right? So what ends up happening is not just the women, okay, but all the men that had jobs, the soldiers that had jobs, the people now at home producing all this stuff for the war, they have money. Okay, you got to remember, we just came out of the Great Depression. So now these women all have this money to spend. The problem is they don't have anything to spend it on. They can't go buy a new car because cars aren't being produced. The factories that they work in are producing airplanes, not cars. Okay, so everything's being produced for the war effort, so there's not as many consumer products to purchase. Okay, so we have money in our economy, but we don't have a lot of things to purchase for the women, but we have plenty of jobs. So this is what's called a Higgins boat. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, this is another derivative of what happened during World War II, where the men were gone playing baseball. Okay, so the women took their place. Okay, and if you've ever seen the movie A League of Their Own, it's based on a real league. Okay, the girls' baseball league. And it took place in places like, I can't think of the town in Indiana, but I've been to the stadium. It's driving me crazy. But like in Peoria, okay, that was one of the team. Rockford, Illinois, the Rockford Peaches were part of this as well. So, all right, this should be Roman numeral 2. Who applied this transition? So how do we go in making all these changes? Like, who made this happen administratively? So who in the government made this happen? This dude's name was James Burns, and this isn't Burns from The Simpsons. Okay, James Burns, he ran the country, so he was in charge of all this. Okay, FDR was worried about the war and what we should do in the war effort. James Burns was the associate president. There was a super agency that was in charge of war production, labor policies, allocating resources to these different places and to the people. So things like rationing, you couldn't use as much rubber for car tires, recycling car tires, using all that recycled rubber for the war effort. Like, somebody had to do that. Well, Burns was in charge of this super agency that took care of that, right? So we had to convert. We had to go from making T-shirts, right, in our factories to making mosquito netting, okay, for our guys in the Pacific that had to fight off the terrible mosquitoes in the humid climates, right? Instead of making typewriters, we would now make machine guns in the factories. The factory owners would be guaranteed a certain percentage, so they're going to make money. Okay, they're going to pass the money that they make along to their employees. So it becomes a situation where the government controls all this and runs it all. The best example of this is the Willow Run plant in Michigan. They went from producing cars, right? If you remember Detroit and Henry Ford, okay, this is one of Ford's factories outside of Detroit. By late 1943, so you're talking 2 years into the war, 2 years after Pearl Harbor, they were producing 340 planes a month. That's more than 10 a day. That's ridiculous. Okay, it's crazy. All right. So here's an example. Okay, this is just from D-Day. Look at the bombers on D-Day. There's 4,450 bombers, 1,300 air transport planes, 670 gliders, almost 4,000 fighter jets. I mean, not jets, but fighter planes. I mean, that's just airplanes. All that stuff had to be produced somewhere. All of the stuff you see on the screen, and this is just for D-Day, all the stuff on that screen came from our factories in the United States. Okay, we were producing things like crazy. It was great for the Allies because we could do this. We could produce them here. If you produce this in England, it's possible the Nazis bombed the plant. Okay, that's not happening in the United States. They didn't bomb anything. So we were able to just kick these things out. And it helps with the war effort, and it employs people in the United States. And socially, like in our society, it proves that women can do these jobs. It proves that African Americans can do these jobs. It proves that Mexican Americans can do these jobs, which you and I know that. But back then, people were questioning if that was the case. More conversion. Henry Kaiser was the master ship builder. He built what are called Liberty ships, and they carried supplies. These things were longer than football fields. Okay, they were huge. He was able to build them in 46 days. So they worked around the clock. They had a phrase in the factory. And I don't know if it was in his factory or in the Higgins factory, but it said, "He who relaxes is helping the Axis." Okay, so encouraging people, right, to produce more and produce it quicker, right? So there's a Liberty ship. You can see how huge that thing is. There's another view, okay, of what it looks like. It's 441 feet. Okay, a football field is 300 feet long. So this thing is longer than a football field. If you literally took this and put it on our football field out here at Belleville East on the campus, it would go out of the end zone on both ends. That's how big this is. Okay, that's crazy, right? And he was producing them in 46 days, right? Okay, more conversion. This is the Higgins guy that I mentioned in the D-Day video that you watched. Eisenhower said he was the man who won the war for us. Okay, because those boats, they're the ones with the flat bottoms on them. Okay, we couldn't have landed on a beach. They were designed not necessarily for troop transport, but for tanks. So when those things roll off, then the tank could just go whoop and drive right off of it. Okay, but they are also great for the troops to run off on D-Day, just like you saw in the video. Okay, so that's Higgins. This is an example of a Higgins boat and what they looked like. And you saw them in the video. Here's one actually still in existence, and this is out on Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. In New Orleans, because Higgins' old factory, okay, today the World War II museum. So that's why it's on Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. Okay, so this is not the exact same boat, but it's a similar idea. It's an amphibious boat. If you've ever rowed the ducks, which I don't even know if you can still do that anymore because they had a disaster down in Branson a few years ago where a bunch of people died on the boat, but they were out in the storm. So, but that's the same idea, right? It'll drive on the ground, and then you can also do it. It's not the exact same thing, but similar. Okay, so big business during the war, because all this stuff is happening. Some of the big businesses stayed, like Coca-Cola. What Coca-Cola did is they got a government contract, so every soldier could get a Coke for 5 cents anywhere, and Coca-Cola produced all this stuff. So if you were somebody that worked in a bottling factory, now you're going to always be working because they're going to be shipping this stuff overseas. Okay, we had to feed everybody too. Don't forget that. Okay, we also had cigarettes that every GI got, which is why the cigarette industry took off like it did after World War II. Then we discovered that it killed you when you smoked cigarettes. So that began to change. Okay, so we became what's known as the arsenal of democracy. Here is what we produced during the war. Okay, 300,000 planes, 80,000 boats, 100,000 tanks, 56,000 merchant ships, 6 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. That is unbelievable. Our guys always had what they needed. Well, not always, but most of the time had what they needed because we did become, in this country, the arsenal of democracy. Remember, Germany is the size of Montana. Okay, so they can produce stuff, but they can't produce stuff like we can because of our size. All right, so how do we pay for all this, right? Somebody's got to pay for this. So look at the numbers. We went from a $9 billion budget to a $95 billion budget in 6 years. Higher taxes on the people. So the people paid 41% of the bill for this. The war bonds paid for the rest of it. Okay, there's an economist who said, John Maynard Keynes is the economist. He said the best way to get out of one of these of depression is massive government spending. Okay, so the government spends money, it puts more money into the economy, those people spend money. I used to think this was crazy because that doesn't make sense if you're in debt to spend more money, but that's what we're doing now. Okay, and with the stimulus checks, right? We're stimulating the economy. They're not just a handout, and for a lot of people, they're going to take that money and go spend it on things they wouldn't have normally purchased. When they do that, they're supplying jobs for other people. Okay, that's kind of what Keynes's theory was. Okay, African Americans in the war effort. It wasn't fair for them. Bottom line, the question is, was it fair for everybody? No, it wasn't. Okay, segregation, Jim Crow laws, that's what the segregation laws were called in the South, named after a fictional character from like the 1830s, 1840s. They still existed, right? But black men were still drafted. So we had a draft, a selective service. You would literally get drafted into the army, and white men got drafted, right? But black men got drafted too. So you could get drafted into the army as a black man in the South and have to go fight and risk your life. And some of them died fighting in the war. But then you couldn't use the same water fountain or bathroom as a white guy in the South, right? So one of the black soldiers in the South had this quote. He said, if he dies in the war, his tombstone will say, here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man, if you had to fight in the Pacific, for the protection of a white man. Okay, because he's fighting for these freedoms that he doesn't get. Okay, and if you look at it from his perspective, that's a pretty crazy thought. In America, some of the civil rights leaders, they seized this opportunity to push, right? To push for civil rights and say, wait a second, if we can fight in the war, then we should also have the rights at home. So African American newspapers suggested a double victory campaign: victory against tyranny overseas and victory for civil rights, or victory against tyranny here in the United States. Okay, there's a link here to an article that will explain to you more about that and about the racism and the thoughts of people, especially the African Americans at the time. Okay, because again, this is history, so we lose sight sometimes of what it would have been like. Imagine being an African American that gets drafted into the war, and then you don't have the same rights. But see, those people they still did it. Guys like this still go and fight. They still went and risk their lives in these situations. Okay, that's pretty darn heroic to go and do something like that. There's also something called the Bracero program. And in the Bracero program, Mexican Americans were brought to the United States. They worked in factories and mainly in farm fields because remember, we had to keep people fed, right? We had all these soldiers overseas and people in the United States had to eat. Okay, the Bracero program existed. So this is weird in today's world because we're trying to keep Mexicans out, right? Build the wall, have policies and everything else about immigration. But between 1941 or 1942 and 1964, over 20 years, we encouraged the idea of bringing people here to work, okay, in the Bracero program, right? Bracero is a Spanish word for labor, right? So it's bringing them here to work in the fields and work in the factories, okay? So there's a picture of some of the Braceros, right, doing the work. These guys are in a truck on their way to a field to get their work done as a part of the Bracero program. So here's the questions, right? What are Higgins boats? Who was the associate president? Okay. What was the plant in Michigan? What's a Liberty ship? 2 examples of brand loyalty. In industry, what did we become to win the war? 2 examples how we paid for the war. How did women contribute to the war effort? And then how did African Americans' contributions to the war lead to the civil rights movement and lead to civil rights overall? And then the last question that should be in there is about the Bracero program. All right, so go ahead and answer those questions if you haven't done so already. Answer the questions in your Google form if you haven't done so already.